Tonight, I want you to picture power the way it actually works in 2025. Not as speeches, not as summits, but as a tanker that never reaches port. As an invoice that suddenly demands 100% payment upfront. As an oil field whose ownership changes without a single shot. Because the United States didn't just sanction Venezuela. It seized more tankers in strategic waters and redirected control over roughly 50 million barrels into a system it can sell at market price. And at the same time, Washington used that leverage to push Caracas to cut economic ties with China. Here is the cognitive trap. You think this is diplomacy. It isn't. It's control of the choke points. If you want to understand why China looks loud but moves carefully, stay with me. And if this kind of clarity matters to you, subscribe, because the next phase is already unfolding. Now, let me show you the mechanism step by step. What you're seeing here is not an isolated move. It's a system revealing itself. Because when a superpower stops negotiating and starts physically redirecting flows, something fundamental has changed. This is no longer about ideology, legality, or even sanctions. It's about who controls the foundations that keep societies running. Energy is not just another commodity. It is the base layer of modern life. Transportation, food, manufacturing, social stability. And that's why this matters so much. China understood this early. That's why it absorbed most of Venezuela's oil exports and nearly all of Iran's. Cheap, steady energy was the quiet pillar under its growth model. Remove that pillar, and everything above it begins to wobble. Now, notice the asymmetry. When China is pressured, it responds with statements. When the United States is dissatisfied, it repositions tankers, controls ports, and rewires supply routes. This isn't escalation by headlines. It's escalation by architecture. And once power operates at the level of infrastructure, it stops asking for permission. That brings us to the deeper question you need to confront next. How did energy become a weapon more decisive than armies? Let's step back and trace how this system was built. To understand why this moment feels different, you have to look backward briefly. But clearly, for most of modern history, power was exercised through access, not seizure. Oil moved through contracts. Influence moved through alliances. Even sanctions were designed to signal not to physically reroute barrels at sea. That world no longer exists. The turning point came when energy markets stopped being flexible and became fragile. Just-in-time supply chains, concentrated choke points, a handful of shipping lanes, a few producers carrying the load for billions of people. At the same time, the United States transformed itself. Over 8 consecutive years, it became the world's largest producer of oil and liquefied natural gas. Energy independence quietly rewired American strategy. Once you no longer depend on the system, you can reshape the system. Venezuela sits at the center of that shift. It holds some of the largest proven reserves on Earth, but lacks the political and naval capacity to protect them. That gap between resources and enforcement is where modern power enters. This is the cycle you're watching. Weak governance, strategic resources, external control. And every time this cycle repeats, the rules move further away from diplomacy and closer to enforcement. Now that context matters, because the next phase isn't theoretical. It's where the system breaks visibly for the first time. Let's talk about the first shock. The first shock didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived quietly at sea. Oil tankers were intercepted. Cargoes were reclassified. And suddenly, barrels that had already been sold were no longer going where buyers expected them to go. This wasn't a warning shot. It was execution. Roughly 50 million barrels were pulled into a different legal and commercial reality, one where control mattered more than contracts. For markets, this was unsettling. For China, it was something worse, a realization that access does not equal security. Because China had done everything right by the old rules, long-term relationships, advance payments, political backing, and none of it mattered once the choke point was touched. That's the lesson markets absorbed instantly. Energy prices didn't just react to volume, they reacted to who now decides where energy flows. Traders understood what headlines missed. This was a demonstration that physical control overrides economic logic. And here's the part that should unsettle you. If this can happen to oil already on the water, it can happen anywhere. The system is thin. Shipping lanes, ports, insurance, payment rails. This was the moment the system stopped being abstract. And once the first seizure works, it doesn't stay an exception. It becomes a template. That's why the next development escalated fast. Not at sea, but inside the technology stack itself. Let's look at the second fracture. Here is the mechanism most people miss. This is not about oil versus chips. It's about trust collapsing inside the system. Because once physical assets can be seized, every paper promise becomes fragile. Contracts matter less, diplomatic assurances matter less. What matters is who can enforce outcomes when the system is stressed. That's why the real signal didn't come from a government press conference. It came from a private company. When NVIDIA demanded 100% payment upfront for advanced chips, it wasn't making a political statement. It was doing risk math, the same logic insurers use, the same logic shippers use, the same logic banks use when confidence evaporates. This is how power propagates now. The state applies pressure at the infrastructure level. Markets internalize that pressure instantly. Private actors adjust before laws even change. China understood the message immediately, not because it was loud, but because it was structural. If energy flows can be redirected, and if technology access can be conditioned on trust that no longer exists, then leverage has shifted below the surface. This is why rare earths don't balance the equation. They can disrupt, they cannot stabilize. Energy and compute are foundational. Without them, nothing else scales. So what you're watching is not escalation, it's re-ranking of what actually matters. And once a system reprioritizes its foundations, the next crisis doesn't come from policy. It comes from reaction. That reaction is where the second shock begins. The second shock didn't come from Washington. It came from Beijing's silence. Because when leverage is tested, what matters isn't what you say. It's what you are willing to risk. China condemned the seizures, called them bullying, issued statements. But it did not escort tankers. It did not challenge control at sea. It did not retaliate where it mattered. That restraint wasn't weakness in tone. It was recognition of exposure. At the same moment, energy access was narrowing. Beijing was scrambling elsewhere, trying to secure alternative supplies while its domestic economy was already under strain. Debt pressures, slowing growth, record trade dependence. The margin for escalation was thin. So China reached for the tools it still controlled. Export threats, rare earth restrictions, symbolic pressure on neighbors like Japan. But notice the imbalance. Energy disruptions threaten social stability. Chip access threatens future capability. Rare earths threaten inconvenience, and adaptation follows. Markets saw it immediately. The response wasn't panic, it was recalculation. Supply chains began adjusting away from vulnerability. Allies tightened coordination. Private firms hardened terms. This is the moment China's leverage narrative cracked. Because once your counterstrike reveals your own fragility, it stops deterring. It starts signaling limits. And limits, once exposed, don't stay theoretical. They shape how everyone treats you next. Now the question shifts from confrontation to consequence. Who absorbs the cost when systems harden this way? That brings us out of abstractions and directly to you. Here is where this stops being a chessboard and starts being personal. Because systems don't absorb shocks. People do. When energy tightens, factories slow first, then transport, then food prices, then jobs. Not all at once, but predictably, quietly, until households feel pressure they can't name, but can't escape. If you live inside a system that depends on uninterrupted energy flows, you are already exposed, whether you think about geopolitics or not. This is why Beijing reacts so carefully. Energy isn't abstract there. It underpins employment, housing stability, social calm. A disruption isn't just economic, it's political. That's why silence can be safer than confrontation. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When superpowers fight at the level of infrastructure, ordinary people pay the adjustment cost long before leaders do. Prices rise before statements change. Credit tightens before policies reverse. Opportunity shrinks before anyone admits there's a problem. If this kind of hidden pressure matters to you, if you want to understand how global power reaches your daily life, stay with me. Share this. Because clarity is becoming a scarce resource. What happens next doesn't stay local. It spreads. And once it spreads, no economy remains insulated. Let's widen the lens and see what this means for the rest of the world. Once pressure hits the foundation, it never stays contained. Because energy doesn't move through countries. It moves through networks. Shipping insurers recalibrate risk. Ports tighten compliance. Banks reassess exposure. What began as a seizure in one region quietly rewrites assumptions everywhere else. This is how global systems transmit stress sideways, not forward. Allies notice first. Energy importing nations begin asking a new question: who can actually guarantee delivery when rules break down? Not the cheapest supplier, not the loudest one, the one with enforcement reach. That's how influence consolidates without formal alignment. Contracts drift, long-term plans adjust, new dependencies form not through ideology, but through reliability under pressure. Rivals notice next. If access can be revoked without war, then stockpiles matter more than diplomacy, redundancy matters more than efficiency, strategic autonomy becomes urgent, expensive, and incomplete. Everyone pays more to feel safer, and no one feels fully secure. And here's the systemic shift most people miss. Globalization doesn't collapse. It hardens. Fewer nodes, fewer trusted routes, tighter circles, higher costs, less forgiveness for failure. That environment favors actors who already control choke points and punishes those who assumed openness would last. Which leads to the final uncertainty you need to face next. Because when systems harden, the future stops being linear. It splits. Let me walk you through the three paths now emerging. From here, the system doesn't move in a straight line. It branches. The first path is managed dominance. Energy flows remain tight but predictable. The United States uses control selectively, enforcing boundaries without pushing rivals into collapse. China adapts, paying more, diversifying slowly, accepting a less efficient but more stable position. The system becomes colder, slower, but avoids rupture. Power consolidates quietly. The second path is strategic friction. Controls multiply, trust keeps eroding, every transaction carries a risk premium, energy and technology become bargaining chips in every negotiation, even unrelated ones, growth slows everywhere, volatility becomes normal, no one wins, but some endure better than others. Then there's the third path, systemic breakage, a miscalculation, a supply shock layered on debt stress. Energy disruption collides with financial fragility. Markets don't wait for leaders to respond, they pull liquidity. Confidence collapses faster than policy can react. What looked like leverage turns into contagion. This is the path history remembers. And notice what determines which path unfolds. Not rhetoric, not intentions, but resilience, who can absorb disruption without panic, who controls essentials when cooperation fails, who can wait longer than the system can endure. That's the quiet test now underway. And once you see that, the final insight becomes unavoidable. Let's close the loop. Here is the insight most people miss until it's too late. Power today is no longer about who speaks the loudest or threatens the hardest. It belongs to whoever controls what the system cannot function without. Oil, energy routes, compute, trust. The United States didn't win leverage by persuasion. It did it by standing on stable foundations, energy independence, enforcement capacity, and institutions that still function under stress. That allowed it to stop arguing about rules and start shaping outcomes. China, by contrast, discovered the danger of dependence all at once. Energy that can be redirected, technology that requires trust, trade that collapses when confidence does. Rare earths look powerful until you realize they don't keep lights on or factories running. This is why the board feels tilted. Not because one side is smarter, but because one side controls the base layer, and that should change how you see the world. Because if power now lives in infrastructure and choke points, then the most important events won't announce themselves. They'll happen quietly through shipping routes, payment terms, and supply decisions you never see. If you want to understand those shifts before they hit headlines, stay here. Subscribe, share this. The next video will break down where the next choke points are forming and who is already positioning to control them. The board is still moving, but now you know how to read it.